Welcome to Project Command International, where fire service leadership, strategy, and execution intersect on a global stage. I'm Captain Duke Cuneo, and in this series, we sit down with some of the most influential public safety leaders from around the world to explore how modern organizations manage complexity, lead through uncertainty, and turn vision into action. From frontline operations to national strategy, these conversations go beyond tactics and into the systems, decisions, and leadership philosophies shaping the future of emergency services worldwide. Today, we're joined by one of the most respected fire service leaders in Australia, Mick Morris. With decades of operational and executive leadership experience in Fire and Rescue New South Wales, Mick has played a major role in shaping modern fire service strategy, organizational leadership, and emergency management at scale. In this conversation, we explored leadership under pressure, decision-making in complex environments, the future of technology and AI in public safety, and what fire service organizations around the world can learn from one another. Mick brings a rare combination of operational credibility, strategic perspective, and forward-thinking leadership, and I'm excited to share this conversation with you. But before we get started, I want to quickly mention our new book, Project Management in the Fire Service, available now on Amazon. This book was written specifically for firefighters, company officers, and chief officers looking to better understand how to lead big projects, manage change, and turn big ideas into executable systems inside the fire service. From apparatus purchases and station projects to policy development, staffing initiatives, and organizational change, this book is designed to provide practical tools that can be applied immediately in today's fire service environment. Just search Project Management in the Fire Service on Amazon to learn more. Now, let's get into our conversation with Deputy Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales, Mick Morris. All right, Mick, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who may not be familiar with your background, can you give us just a quick overview of your career and kind of your current role over there at Fire and Rescue New South Wales?
Sure. So I've been with Fire and Rescue New South Wales now for coming up on 36 years. Obviously started on the front line on the trucks, like everyone does, and I've been very fortunate across my career to undertake a number of specialised roles, both on the front line as well as sort of back of house or operational support things. So at various times in my career, I've been a rescue operator, I've been a hazmat technician, and have had frontline leadership roles as a station officer or in charge of a crew, and then as a duty commander or battalion chief equivalent, and then the various senior command roles. And they've been balanced with aspects in that operational support or corporate sort of functions around an operations research unit role. I looked after our employee welfare sort of aspects for a little while and looked after our operational improvement portfolio as well as our community safety and research portfolio for the organisation, and very fortunate to currently occupy the position as the Deputy Commissioner of Field Operations.
Okay. So as Deputy Commissioner of Field Operations, obviously you are working with your folks out in the field to some degree, but probably mostly instituting larger policy decisions and integrating systems that are going to make a difference for your folks out there. Tell us a little bit about Fire and Rescue New South Wales and the kind of issues that you're dealing with currently.
Sure. So as a state-based fire service, we are the fourth largest urban fire service in the world. So I currently have 335 stations spread across the state, just under 7,000 permanent firefighters, supported by 550 administrative and trades-related staff. And my portfolio, apart from those frontline stations, I also have the Community Safety Directorate that reports directly to me. So that's all of our built environment, working on our engineers, our community risk reduction planning teams, our fire investigation and research team. So quite a diverse portfolio, and probably about 90% of the organisation staff sitting under the command structure that I'm responsible for.
Wow. Yeah, so this is exactly the sort of complexity and systems focus that we really wanted to bring to Project Command International. So really, really excited to bring you on first up to have, like you said the third or fourth largest urban fire system in the world. That's pretty incredible. So along those lines, when you're instituting these systems and making these decisions in the fire service, we tend to celebrate individual performance quite often, great stops, rescues, the big moments. But at your level, success really is about systems and those larger decisions and decision making. How do you think about building systems, and how do you consistently deliver results in your role?
Yeah, it is very much a systems view of the world, and all of those aspects that you talked about frontline service delivery are incredibly important. And I remember, and it still love the pride of our people in terms of the excellence of the service delivery they provide at the pointy end. But I'm really conscious of the fact that the pointy end, and I have this conversation quite often with my teams, is I need them to be technically proficient operators at the pointy end when time matters and to effect those great saves and all of those sorts of things. But the reality is there is a lot of work that we can be doing in terms of planning, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of community risk reduction delivery programs that are about getting upstream and avoiding those crises from happening to members in our community. And I ask that of our team from the point of view of, without diminishing that frontline operational role, once those bells go off and you're responding to a crisis in the community, you are dealing at the margins. And so your opportunities are quite narrow, but there is a lot that can be done downstream or upstream, I should say, ahead of that could have prevented that from occurring, could have put the community in a much better place to either prevent or to appropriately respond to the circumstances that were developing before them. And they will still always need our intervention, but that should be an integral part of how we view our service, not just the sole focus.
No, that makes perfect sense. Obviously here in the States, there's been a long time focus on CRR, and certainly over the last 25, 30 years, there's been a lot of not just focus, but improvements, through that focus. And so we've seen that here as well. I wonder if when you look at your career thus far and moving from operations at, as you called it, the pointy end, I love that. One of the great things about interviewing international leaders is some of the different lingo. We love that when we talk to folks. That's awesome. But so what I do wonder is kind of moving from that end of operations into your role. What were some of the challenges you faced, and what even maybe caused you to move into the sort of role, administrative role that you're in now?
Look, I think it is always that challenge of trying to understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and then sort of looking at things and going, well, why does it happen this way? I think there's a better way of doing this. How would I influence that being a better way of doing things? And that's led to, that curiosity for exploring the various roles that I've talked about in terms of my career. I think I've just that curiosity is there from that systems point of view. Like, I am always really keen to understand, how did it arrive at this point of view? Why does it look the way it looks? How might it be changed? And then thinking about all of those aspects. And I think one of the greatest strengths that our operational people bring, but then also one of the challenges when you start moving from those frontline service delivery roles to thinking about the system more holistically, is that we are brilliant problem solvers. But in being brilliant problem solvers, we're very clear at jumping to a solution very fast. And it might not be the best solution just because it's logical, it's rapid, it addresses the thing without taking that step back to think about what other things are at play here, is influencing all of those aspects that come together. What might I be missing in this rapid decision making? Then until we sort of have that space to step back and think more holistically and systematically, then we're at a danger of making rapid decision that might be right in the short term, but might have long-term unintended consequences for both the thing that we're focused on and for the people involved.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things that it makes me wonder about, you were speaking about, how you look at things holistically, particularly thinking about things as a frontline operator, what that looks like. You've operated at the highest levels of command, both in operations and now in administration. When you're making decisions with incomplete information, as we often do in this job, in this career, they also have high consequences. What does your process actually look like in decision making?
I think as sort of reflecting on what are the various perspectives at play here, and what perspectives might not have a voice in the room. And even if I can't get them into the room, how can I take into account what those perspectives are likely to be, and consider them as part of that decision-making process so that it's not having those unintended consequences. Or if you really can't get to it, trying to accept that I'm going to have some blind spots in the decision making, and be prepared that when new information's presented, being prepared to reflect and review the decisions that have been made and alter them if required.
Yeah, I think recognizing that there are blind spots or could be blind spots is a really valuable skill for all leaders, but particularly when we get into administrative roles. When we're not out there in the field every day, I think it's easy to get into a spot where you don't see everything. And so I think that is a really important point. Mick, I do want to pivot a little bit. When we spoke before, you told me quite a bit about the early part of your career and then taking a little bit of a break, and you had a personal tragedy, but I think that shaped the latter half of your career talking to you. And I wonder if you would tell our audience a little bit about that and how that's evolved.
Sure. So my son Samuel had a non-fatal drowning accident when he was 2 years, 8 months old. Occurred in our backyard swimming pool. Part of, and I'll be forever in awe of my wife and her presence of mind in the circumstances. So here, our fire service doesn't run the medical response capability, so we're not an ambulance service. We have a separate state-based ambulance service. So she not only made the 000 or the equivalent of the 911 call to request an ambulance, she had the presence of mind to make a second call, ask for the fire service command centre, identify who she was and the circumstances she was in. So one of my fire crews was early there. Samuel thankfully survived that accident, but was left with a catastrophic brain injury. And he survived for about 8 years, with dealing with all of the consequences of a hypoxic brain injury and the associated disabilities and challenges. But that put me into a whole complex system that I was certainly not familiar with. And that natural curiosity that we sort of spoke about earlier was evident there because I was sitting in a room with highly complex teams, multidisciplinary teams, and looking at the way things were happening and starting to ask those questions of them to say, hey, look, I really appreciate what you're doing here, but can you explain to me why this is occurring this way? Because, I'm not quite sure. I don't understand how this works. And then putting that perspective into the system for them, saying, look, from a parent of a child who's dealing with this, here's the complexity that we're dealing with as a family and the challenges we have within your system. Here's a viewpoint from me that I think might be of assistance. And that led to a raft of opportunities within consumer healthcare advocacy on a range of being invited into different committees to look at process improvements, all those sorts of aspects. And that led to working all the way up to an international collaboration or participating in an international collaboration that looked at the first outcome standard set for paediatric healthcare. So just that natural curiosity and asking, and by being exposed to just both continuing a career within the fire service, but then a whole different aspect of a complex dynamic system of so many moving parts, and being given permission to explore that curiosity and invited in really then started to shape a different way of looking at, well, what was it I was delivering when I came to work? How was I delivering that? Why was I delivering it in these ways? What other opportunities existed to look at how things might change? And shortly after Samuel died, that's when I moved across into the operational improvement portfolio with fire and rescue.
So given what you went through, I can definitely see how that would give you a passion for changing the way these systems work, particularly seeing them on the side of a consumer. I can also relate in seeing issues that I ran into with my daughter's health, and seeing for the first time some of these complex hospital systems and working with multidisciplinary teams and really maybe for the first time understanding what so many patients that I had taken to a hospital or treated and, gotten to a higher level care were actually going through for the first time. And so, what I wonder about how you pivoted is the systems that you saw that were working. Were you able to build off of those? I know you mentioned you were working with I believe it was the WHO at one point on an initiative with that. What did you see that worked, and maybe what did you see that didn't?
Yeah, look, I guess what worked was the ability of people within that system to both accept in a gracious way the questions that were being asked and then to provide those opportunities to participate. I think in parallel to that, what I didn't mention was the drowning prevention work that resulted out of Samuel's accident. So the foundation that was built in his name, we then worked with Royal Lifesaving Society, and that was similar. We sort of went to them and said, look, hey, I'm looking at, how do I turn what's happened to us into something useful? I'm looking at the data that you guys produce, and nowhere do I see the stories of Samuel represented. So, the media narrative of someone like Samuel is either the tragic story that a child died in a backyard swimming pool accident, or the miraculous survival, and not this status in between, and I don't see it in the data. So that was where, in the similar vein to the health system, some really amazing people from Royal Lifesaving Society of Australia embraced us, openly took our questions, and then enabled us to work with them. They now produce an annual drowning report that includes non-fatal data. We looked at all of the financial and economic consequences of that in terms of a prevention things, changed the cost-benefit analysis around prevention programs, and then all of that in terms of ability to address international audiences was, as I said, in parallel, the outcomes framework for pediatric health, but then the contribution that those questions raised to the World Health Organization now looking at the data standards internationally for how non-fatal drowning is recorded globally to better understand the burden of drowning globally. And it's the same sort of approach now bringing into the fire service world that says, actually, what are we measuring ourselves against? Are they the right measures? How would we improve those? And then even in terms of, again, some of those economic benefits of some of the prevention programs we're arguing, are we really taking into account all the downstream costs? What are our impacts on not only the community member that we're serving, but in terms of those built infrastructure questions, in terms of insurance premiums, in terms of government policy around prevention aspects and the investment in those, upstream preventions to stop the stuff happening in the first place. It's been that ability that's worked well is when people have been open to that curiosity and embracing someone who's prepared to ask the questions about the status quo and to do so in a constructive way. Where it hasn't worked is often where you run into the mindset or some systems that are incredibly resistant to change and just don't even want to hear any question around where their aspects are. So I think, that one of those key lessons for me is to remain curious myself, but to look for those opportunities for that. How does it happen constructively rather than combatively?
Wow. Yeah, it's pretty incredible how you've been able to turn such a tragedy. And of course, it is that. And I appreciate you being so open and candid with us about all that. But it's amazing how you've been able to turn that into something that's been a positive and made an impact internationally, not just in Australia, not just in the fire service there, but across the world. You mentioned change quite a bit in there. And so that is something that we talk about a lot, which is change management in the fire service. And I wonder, when you talk about having over 300 fire stations and, thousands of firefighters, what does that look like for you when you're changing a policy or maybe instituting a new system, building a new project, something that's different for firefighters? How do you, from your perspective, at such a high level, institute change and do it in a way that the boots on the ground will accept?
Look, there's always the acceptance of the reality that no matter what change you make, there's going to be a proportion of the people, of the boots on the ground, who will never accept the change, never accept the rationale of what the change is. And I think I look at it from the perspective of understanding that any change that we seek to make necessarily means that there's a loss of something for the people involved. So in order to change, there has to be, both the embrace of what's good and how we improve it, but also the letting go of certain other aspects of things. And I also accept that, I'm quite privileged to have had some of the experiences I've had and those viewpoints, and to see the bigger picture of what's at play. And one of the biggest challenges is trying to explain in an appropriate way all of the various things that I'm considering that might not be apparent to the boots on the ground. So it is, again, as I said, they're very expert solution makers, and say, but if I was dealing with that, I would have done it this way for this reason. You go, well, great, that was one of the considerations that went into it, but here's the 25 other factors that influence the decision. So trying to do that in a way that whether it's a policy or whether it's more in terms of the intent that I've set as the Deputy Commissioner and the structure, is trying to connect it to a way that makes today's action on the front line valued, and how it links to the strategy that we're trying to achieve, so that you can be sure that if you're answering these questions that I pose to you at the front line, you will, A, be a high-performing individual, your team will be high-performing, and you'll be clearly contributing to the strategy. And then asking them to maintain that awareness of, while we're doing the work at the senior level around strategy, around the future, here's how we're trying to shape the future of that. What's going on that might change in your environment, so you can anticipate what's coming down the line and not be surprised by it. So it's really trying to give that clarity of expectation, the transparency of what we're working on, and trying to take people on that journey of having the conversations of, here's where we're going, here's why we're going, but here's why what you're doing today is critically important to the achievement of those outcomes for us as an organisation on behalf of the community that we serve.
No, that makes a lot of sense. We had a leader once in the department that I worked for who often likened it to doing a scene size up when you got to a house fire. Whenever there was a big decision to be made, administratively, is that, he needed to look at it from all sides of the house to make the right decision. And then once you started to do that, you could understand the decisions that he was making, or that somebody in admin was making. So yeah, no, that's a really excellent perspective. You mentioned strategy. One of the things that big organizations struggle with, I know ours does, and, I work for a fire department that's small compared to yours, but here in the States, a fairly large one, around 700 firefighters. And, large organizations struggle with alignment. Strategy at the top doesn't always translate to execution on the ground. How have you approached closing that gap, particularly at such a scale as you're dealing with?
I think when we've talked previously, I've talked about, I have a what I call my one-pager that sort of creates that link. So it has the very clear, so our current organisational strategy has 4 pillars attached to it: safe and capable staff, our financial and resource management, around risk reduction in the community, and adapting for the future. And so in terms of my one-pager, I've then put together a visual diagram that says, look, here's the reality that everything we do has to be underpinned by our organisational values of respect, integrity, service and courage. I talk then about building our culture, and I'm very clear in that conversation. I say building our culture, not changing it, because I'm incredibly privileged to serve thousands of men and women who are showing up every day doing amazing things on behalf of the community. It goes without saying that in an organisation of our scale, there is always that percentage of people who are not doing the right thing and harm the reputation of others. So working on building that culture with a very clear focus that the whole reason we exist is operational service delivery excellence to the community. And so to build that, I talk about operational readiness, and each of the priority areas that I talk about has 3 questions attached to it that are scalable depending on, if you're a recruit firefighter, you ask these questions, they're situated to where you are, but if you answer them and you're focused on them, That's your contribution to strategy. So talk about operational readiness. Do you know what your risks are? Do you have plans in place to address it? And do you know what your capabilities are supposed to be? And how can you demonstrate to others that are ready to go? We talk about community risk reduction. Are you appropriately connected to the right community leaders, the community groups and business groups in your particular area of service? Do you have implementation plans for all of our prevention programs? And are you prepared to try new things in partnership with those particular community groups? I talk about trust and advocacy. So, whether that's our local government representatives or our state members of parliament, how are we presenting into that community? So do we know who those senior stakeholders are in your various command? Do you have regular meetings and engagement with them? Do you understand what they want, need, and expect from us? And the purpose of that is to both demonstrate that we are delivering value into the community on behalf of the government, and that the government can have trust in us that we're delivering the best possible way we can. The flip side of that is partnerships and planning. So from the front line, can we clearly articulate what we're asking of central business units and why? When central business units are asking something of us at the front line, do we understand what they're trying to achieve and why they're trying to achieve it? And if those things can't answer three fundamental questions, then we really should be having a robust conversation about what we're doing. And those questions are around, is it improving the service delivery or experience of our frontline service delivery staff? Is it improving our service delivery to the community? And are they aligned to our organisational plans and strategy? And if they're not doing those three things, we really have to have a conversation about the how and why. And the last priority that goes into it is around financial responsibility and accountability. So, are you making the most financially responsible and sustainable decision you can from your point of view in, what you're doing? Are you making sure that you're contributing to the appropriate governance and following of the rules, et cetera, around that, and embedding that sort of process to make sure that we are clearly demonstrating, again, that value to the community, that every dollar they invest in us is being spent correctly. And again, that comes from the frontline firefighters around, not ordering stuff unnecessarily, around making sure that you're raising problems with your fleet or your property early to the appropriate central business unit, so that preventative maintenance is better than break and repair maintenance. So really looking at it from, again, that systems point of view, your small action here has a big impact somewhere else. So collectively, those things I can point together on the one pager, and then under each of those strategy pillars has a link that says, if you combine, this, and this together, then that's your contribution to safe and capable staff. If you're doing this, and this, that's your contribution to reducing risk in the community. So you can see that all of those day-to-day priorities have a very clear linkage to those strategic outcomes for the organisation. And then when I say, hey, and here's the projects we're working on at corporate, here's how it's likely to impact your service delivery in those various priority areas.
It's a pretty amazing way to tie it all together. I couldn't help but really resonate with the idea of the fiscal responsibility that so often I think firefighters, like myself, I'm in operations now as a captain. And, so often we sort of grizzle at the idea of worrying about fiscal policy or fiscal responsibility. We want to run the calls, we want to do the job, and we want to help people. Almost all of us would look at it and say, well, yeah, of course, this job is about the community. It's about them. It's about us taking care of them. But so often I think we forget that being fiscally responsible with those resources is also part of taking care of our communities, because they're the ones that are paying for all of this. And so I love that you bring that perspective into that sort of one pager. And yeah, I think that probably is a really great way to test all the actions that are happening against those three questions. So, Commissioner, you've had a global perspective on the fire service. I think that's safe to say. You've been over here in the States working some. We talked about that in our previous conversation. Having been in the States a little bit, and this doesn't have to be a controversial answer, but but it is something that I'll be curious about. What are some things that maybe countries around the world are doing better than the U.S. is in terms of the fire service?
Look, there are always those interesting questions. Are they doing better or doing worse? Look, I think there's certainly an exchange of lessons going back and forth between all of the connections internationally. And I think that's one thing that as a sector we do very, very well, that we do connect globally we do share lessons amongst each other, and that ability to do as I did. I jumped across into a deployment as from Australia into the Western fires a few years back, and to look at the systems approach of, you obviously have aim, aims, and then we have the Australian equivalent of that. And it's one of those questions when you deploy in those circumstances where you go, actually, how applicable is this skill set from me? Is it actually the same? And that ability to drop into a system, watch what was happening, ask those questions and go, okay, actually, these two systems are exactly the same, but I still have these differences that I need to consider. And how do I ask the right questions to get that exposure? So I think that collective openness to sharing lessons and to embracing each other's experiences and differences puts us in a really good position internationally as a sector.
Yeah, I think, the embrace of the fire service, or I'm sorry, the fire services embrace here in the States of the incident command system has been a double-edged sword. It's done phenomenal things for those large-scale incidents and small-scale. That's the whole point. It's supposed to be able to be applied in all sorts of different emergencies. On the administrative side, I think we see it as getting applied too often in administration because the system was designed to manage emergencies, not necessarily projects. And that's how my partner, Peter Eunice, and I, really kind of got into this, was talking about, actually, let's apply business project management principles to administration, not necessarily operate everything like it's an emergency. And so I do think that it's pretty neat to hear that when you were able to come over from Australia, some of the same principles that you were applying, maybe probably like at bush or wildfires out there, were applicable here.
Yeah, and look, some of those differences. So, I came in, I looked at the role that I was asked to play in the incident in the command team in those Western fires, and went, okay, I know what this role does within my structure. And that, again, that curiosity said, what does this really look like? And one of the interesting learnings for me was I took on a safety officer role in one of the incident management teams, and went, cool, I know what that looks like. We'd had our good briefings coming in, different fauna, different trees, different risks associated with different things. But what I didn't expect in my role was that I was also looking after the airfield as part of that. And went, I know from my perspective, I know nothing about air operations and all of those sorts of things. How do I rapidly learn that? And being paired to somebody given the learning module or the book, the sign-off, and rapidly working through that in your system to go, okay, now I've got an awareness of that. I'm not going to have the detailed knowledge, but I know what I have to be asking questions about to have an assurance myself that I'm appropriately managing those risks on behalf of the incident management team. And I think what you've hit on in terms of there's lots of parallels between our incident management structures and, then taking an approach to the management of projects within the system. And look, in terms of disciplines, they might have completely different names for things and different ways of looking at it. But if you do that little bit of intellectual mapping yourself, not really much to it. You've got a project manager who's your IC. You've got someone who's looking after this aspect. Well, that's, your data analyst is your intelligence person in your IMT. It's not that difficult to really see how the two disciplines combine, and then to find your way through, okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to pivot real quickly. I've got a couple more questions for you, Commissioner. I want to be respectful of your time, of course, and I certainly appreciate, again, you joining us. One thing we talk a lot about on this podcast and in our articles, et cetera, is, we're seeing a rapid technological advancement right now. In fact, that's basically all you hear about if you turn on television or scroll the internet. Artificial intelligence, AI, and the technology that comes along with that. I think when we chatted a couple of weeks back, we talked a lot about that and how that's changing the fire service, particularly on the administrative sides. From your perspective, how is AI going to impact the fire service in the long run, both operational and organizationally? And I kind of, if I can ask a follow-up, in advance, like, what do you think the downsides are of that?
Yeah, look, AI is just that, as I said, it's the buzzword, it's everywhere. It's the pivot point, it's the next iteration of, the internet boom from earlier much earlier in our careers where, all of a sudden there was all this information that's available to you. I think I'm experimenting. I use a couple of different tools, obviously within my workplace and all the cyber rules that go around that. And I use a couple of different tools outside. I'm exploring, figuring out how do I make this work. So it has some good benefits in terms of assisting in the automation of some tasks, in terms of rapid analysis of certain documents and various ways of looking at things. I think the downside of it is the challenge we have at the moment is creating the space to do the experimentation and to do it appropriately without creating risks to our people or our organizations. The downside that we have is that the speed of it means that the volume of stuff that people who are wanting to do nefarious things or with the best of intent are trying to get answers to things can produce high level, high volume stuff repeatedly. And the burden of that is on the decision making of people in the pointy decision making aspects, particularly in an administrative sense, that what used to be, yeah, I know that, I understand where that person's coming from. Now that same person can generate a 3-page response to you in no time at all. It's full of stuff that you then have to be either trying to parlay with another AI tool or actually doing the thinking yourself about what's the validity of this, where does it come from, how does it influence it, is it relevant? So, that experimentation, the adaptation of the tools has some benefit to us, also has some real cognitive load challenges for us.
Yeah, I think we definitely see it often already where, 10 years ago, even there was still a large premium on word count in a way, when you were writing things, whether that was a paper for school or a document for work, and that's gone. There you get so many, whether you're sifting through job applications or you name it, you get so much of that AI slop effect where, it's just pages and pages of volume, and that actually ends up creating more work for us in a lot of ways because you have to read it, and it doesn't take long to figure out what's going on there. That's for certain. And the other aspect of it that I think about from the operational side is how much more information can the firefighter sitting in the front seat of an engine absorb in the 2 minutes that he's en route to a call, that he isn't mapping out a route and finding a fire hydrant and making sure everybody around him is safe. That time is vanishingly small, and the more information we throw at everybody, the less time they have to even think about what they're going to. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is how we can take all this great information coming in, whether that's through AI or that's just through better GIS systems, et cetera, but distilling it down into single screen dashboards, things that give you the information that matters without actually creating more complication for somebody up front.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there is a wealth of information. And as I said, I have my community safety directorate with all the engineers doing all of that. So, as a service, we have a large volume of information on a whole bunch of built environment and critical infrastructure services. That how do you get that out of the system, translated into something useful and meaningful as part of either a pre-incident plan or, as you talk about, en route, rapid intelligence around, we've got smart systems in buildings now that give that building information management system can tell you exactly what room things are going on in, what the temperatures are. How do we make that information available for that size up related aspect combined with the layout of the building? There's so much opportunity to potentially avoid that risk to a degree at the pointy end that we can tap into. But I think the immaturity of how we're doing some of the basic tasks first is going to have to be explored before we can really leap into some of that highly technical and mature approach to turning all of that into useful and relevant intelligence.
Useful and relevant. Yeah, no, that's very, very well put. So my last question for you, and this is something that we always talk about, but from your perspective, if you could give one piece of advice to a fire service leader that's trying to manage complexity, and deliver results at scale, just one piece of advice, what would it be?
Wow. Look, I think we've touched it on a few times on the way through, is to stay curious, stay open, be always acknowledging that you won't have all the information you need. You make the best decision you can possibly make on the available information, but be prepared to reflect, review, and change the decision when new information makes it necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay curious. That is a great, easy mantra that I think just about anybody, can follow, whether in the fire service or not, if they're trying to make good decisions and really see complexity for what it is. Well, Mick, I really appreciate you coming on today. This was a pretty fascinating discussion, and I know a lot of our viewers would maybe want to reach out or hear more about what you do. Is there anywhere they can follow you on like social media, LinkedIn, anything like that?
Yep. So you can certainly find me on LinkedIn. So it's Michael Morris, but you'll find the Mick in the middle. So easy to find because there's about a billion Michael Morrises in the world. So if you type in Michael Mick Morris for LinkedIn, you'll find me that way. And all the relevant contact details are there. It's probably the easiest way to get in touch and happy to talk to anyone.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, that's going to do it for today. So thanks again for being our first guest on Project Command International. And once again, Deputy Commissioner Mick Morris, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Duke. Really appreciated the invite and the conversations both in the lead up to and to today, and looking forward to see where the rest of the international cohort takes this.
Fantastic. Take care.